Today, we are hearing from Sami, who has recently taken his EV from northern France to Casablanca in Morocco. A trip that is more than 2,500 kilometers one way, and he made the journey back too. He has done this on a Hyundai Ioniq EV 28 kilowatt hours that had more than 200,000 kilometers on the odometer, and that was without any overnight stay. Most of you thought that that trip would take 48 hours. Well, let's hear from him how he's done it and why.
My name is Sami. I've been driving an EV for a little over 5 years now. I started with a very small car, a Citroën C0, really the archetype of the tiny car. So I used it for a number of years, especially during my student years. Then I switched to a car that was a little more comfortable, the Volkswagen Ioniq first generation. I then came back to a C0 for a few months. And then I switched to the Ioniq, a first Ioniq, then a second Ioniq. So I've had a few electric cars in the past and the experience that comes with it. I've been following the development of EVs for, let's say, 5 years with the evolution of the infrastructure, which has been very, very fast in France. Today it allows to go really anywhere in Europe. In general, in Europe, it's not too difficult. With the Ioniq, I had already done a few trips, road trips in Europe really, in Belgium, Germany, and Luxembourg over a few days, so the idea was to visit the various cities without taking ages and sleeping in the car. So I had transformed it into a mini camper van.
Now let's talk about going to Morocco with a short-range EV. Is it a crazy idea?
Yes, maybe I'm crazy. The idea behind this trip was to show to people who were skeptical about electric cars that it was possible to go far. To go very far by using an old car with a small battery and over 200,000 kilometers on the odometer. So I went with my wife. My wife followed me on this trip. That's a little bit special, let's say. And in the end, it went relatively well. We did more than 7,000 kilometers, I think, including both the return trip and the visiting of the local places. So there were two of us driving. My wife would take the wheel when I was feeling a bit tired. The idea was that she would pick up when I was tired, because we did the whole journey without any overnight stay. With only 2 weeks of vacation, we wanted to be the least amount of time traveling. So I would drive as long as I am not tired. Then when she would drive for 1 or 2 legs in between charges. And then we would switch so she could rest.
All right, let's talk about planning the trip now.
It was the first time I did this trip from north of France to Casablanca with an electric car. I wanted the trip to cost me as little as possible. And at the time, the network with the lowest price was Tesla. So the idea was to go exclusively, or at least as much as possible, through the Tesla supercharger network. For the planning, I simply used ABRP, a better route planner, which allows you to plan your route according to your vehicle, but above all to adjust the parameters. For instance, you can say you don't want to get below 15% state of charge. You can also adjust parameters in a very fine way as a function of what you know about your car, and as a function of what I want to do. Knowing that during the actual trip, I sometimes recharged more than what ABRP announces. And so sometimes there were little adjustments where we said, well, no, we'll arrive there with too much percentage. Let's continue to the next stage.
Now, how was the charging of the car along the way?
So I went to a higher state of charge as I wanted to rest between each charge, and given the Ioniq recharges reasonably fast, the body would not be quite up for it. So ended up exceeding the 80% mark needed to go to the next charging station. I had planned the stations that interested me, that I wanted to go on Tesla. Well, most of the time I arrived with a state of charge higher than what was planned. And then, on this car, I didn't like to go too low because it generated more heat for me, as it's air-cooled. Generating more heat for the battery would not be great. And then, I preferred not to go too low as there were voltage drops at lower state of charge. On a long trip like this, on this car, with more than 200,000 kilometers, I therefore preferred not to go too low. But, well, this part is purely technical. To manage the temperature, I put all the fans facing down and I made sure with a bag to plug the top part of the air inlet, which allowed to force the air inlet to take the fresh air from the ground. So I activated all the cooling available that was at the back.
Okay, it's time to talk about speeds on the road now.
In Spain, the speed limit is 120 kilometers per hour. I tend to drive 10 kilometers per hour below the limitation. And also in Spain, there were big climbs and big descents. And there, the idea was to limit the draw on the battery and therefore reduce the speed. The limit in France is 130 kilometers per hour, so I stuck to 120. And on this Ioniq, at 120 kilometers per hour, you really get the best compromise in terms of efficiency and speed of travel. Especially at night, I avoided going too fast. The objective was not to arrive as quickly as possible, but it was to take enough time to cope with the fatigue accumulated on the trip. We did not want to put ourselves in danger unnecessarily. And on the way, we knew that we had to arrive on a Saturday. As long as we arrived on Saturday, we were doing very well. So, nothing forced us to go faster.
A word on efficiency now.
On this journey, the efficiency of the car is really impressive. You can't find anywhere else on an EV. I've never, until now, tried a car that offered such impressive efficiency as the Ioniq. And it's a shame. It's a shame that we don't have such efficient cars on the market, even on the most recent cars.
How about charging stations? How good was the experience?
In France, zero issues with charging the car. I had no fear of going from point A to point B. It was super easy to go from one Tesla station to another. And even if I accelerated or I saw that I might be a bit short of range, I took the first exit on the highway and I had a charging station. In Spain, it's less dense as a network, but plenty enough for what I needed.
J'avais mal anticipé ma consommation électrique à un moment parce qu'il y a eu d'un seul coup, quand je suis monté en altitude, une
At
grosse
some
baisse de
point, I didn't
température
anticipate well
avec
my electric
justement
consumption. I
une
went up in
le fait que
altitude and
j'avais
that
roulé
combined with a high
à
speed
l'aller
and big
avec
temperature drop,
une vitesse assez élevée lorsque j'étais en montée. Tout ça a fait que je suis arrivé au sommet,
I
j'étais
was
bien en
well
dessous de ce
below
que
what I
j'avais
had
prévu à la base.
anticipated.
Mais là aussi, une petite recharge charge map j'ai trouvé une borne rapide à 5 km de là où j'étais. Et donc je suis parti, je
I
l'ai
did a
rechargé
charge
et
5
effectivement,
kilometers away using the Charge
aucun
Map
stress à
Pass.
ce niveau-là. Même en Espagne, même si le réseau est moins dense, on
Although the
trouvait des
network is less
solutions. Alors, on
dense,
trouvait
there
pas
are
les solutions les
options.
moins chères, hein. L'idée, c'était de dépanner pour pouvoir continuer sa route.
Not necessarily the
Mais ça
cheapest
permettait
options,
de
but
recharger le
enough to go to
nécessaire
the
pour aller
next
sur le bord de
Tesla,
l'Espagne
which
et
was the
ça marchait.
cheapest.
Et enfin, le Maroc. Alors, le Maroc, c'est
Morocco
vraiment
is different.
balbutiant.
This is
Le réseau de
nascent when it
recharge est
comes
vraiment
to the charging
balbutiant.
infrastructure.
C'est un peu le constat qu'on avait sur les bornes de recharge en Europe il y a
It's a bit like 3 to 4 years
3
ago
4
in
ans à peu
Europe.
près. Ils sont à peu près à ce stade-là, où on a
Often it's
souvent
a
des
single
monobornes.
EV charger,
Donc bon, si elles sont en panne, ça remonte
but
le
if
temps.
they're
Mais
broken
l'avantage,
or
c'est
need a
que même
reboot,
si elles sont
you
en
ask
panne,
at the
il
service
y a toujours
station.
quelqu'un dans la station-service qui est capable de redémarrer, faire des trucs. Ils n'hésitent pas à ouvrir et
And they have no issue with opening up, fixing
Ils ont pas
something,
besoin d'appeler un
doing
professionnel
stuff.
pour le faire.
They do that
Donc ils le font
themselves
eux-mêmes
without the
et
need to
ça
call
marche très
anyone.
bien. Et après, l'autre réseau de charge qui est un peu plus sérieux, c'est donc FastVolt,
The charging
qui
network that's a
eux
bit more
essayent
established
de
is
déployer
FastVolt.
l'infrastructure.
They
Mais là
try to
aussi,
deploy the infrastructure.
c'est vraiment les
But there
débuts.
too, it's really
Au
the
début, on met des
beginning,
monobornes,
mostly
on met
single
parfois
chargers,
quelques
sometimes two
bipornes,
chargers, but that's it.
mais c'est tout. Mais jusque maintenant, chez eux, j'ai jamais eu de soucis. J'arrivais,
But
je
until
chargeais
now,
sans
with
souci.
FastVolt,
Et pour un
I
coût assez
never had a
faible,
problem.
c'est-à-dire
I
que pour
arrived,
2
I plugged
semaines,
in, I charged, it was done.
alors eux, on paye un abonnement. On a payé un abonnement à la semaine.
And for a fairly low
Et
cost.
pour
With
2
them, we pay a
semaines, j'en ai eu
subscription.
pour
We pay a subscription per week.
15 ou 20
And
euros,
for
un
2
truc comme
weeks, it cost me something like 15 or 20 euros, something like that. So, not much.
Well, it's now time to recap and conclude.
L'idée,
The objective was to show to those skeptical around me that such a trip is possible even in the worst conditions. When we take an old EV, the Ioniq is a very good electric car, but still an old car fundamentally not designed to cover long distances like this. I'm not sure the engineers thought about this kind of usage at all. But the idea was to take an electric car that was part of the first that were released that could do this trip with a small battery, slightly degraded, but with more than 200,000 kilometers.
Légèrement dégradée, mais avec plus de 200 000 une voiture avec plus de 200 000 km et montrer que on peut se débrouiller pour faire des très longues distances.
The objective was to show that we can handle it to cover very long distances, and that charging is never a concern.
En faisant l'aller-retour comme ça, bon, il y avait mes collègues étaient le premier à dire que
Going back and forth like that to Morocco, my colleagues were the first to say that as soon as the 500 first kilometers, I was going to call a truck to come and pick me up and take me home. Well, it was not the case, and I came back with the car in perfect condition, which worked just as well as before leaving. And today, most of my colleagues are thinking about switching to an electric vehicle. Same thing with my grandparents. My grandparents were a little worried. I have been talking to them for a number of years, but it really showed them that, in reality, it's largely possible, even in the worst conditions. You do have to be clear about one thing, though. If I talk to someone who doesn't know anything about electricity and I say, well, I stopped every 80, 100 kilometers to recharge, they're going to say, see, mate, electric cars, it's not ready, innit? No. The idea was also to explain the approach. Here it is. It's an old car with an old and very small battery. It's able to charge at a decent speed, but nothing outstanding. And not at par with more recent EVs. With something that's not designed for such a long trip, it proved possible. It proved to different skeptical people around me that, well, it's possible. And that buying a Tesla Model 3, for example, or a Kona, or a recent car, an EV6, which is great, you can do these trips without any worries or anxiety.
So these were the concluding words. Thank you to Sami for sharing his experience. I hope you found that useful. Please do like and comment on this video. And if you think you've got an experience to share as well, do reach out. Thank you for watching and goodbye.